Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for shuffling up and making a friend. It's going to be a wonderful night here tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. But before we get started, please let me introduce Daniel Ross, a Wiradjuri man who's going to be giving us our welcome to country. Daniel's worked in the construction sector and cultural heritage space for most of his life. He's worked towards advocating for growth and education for First Peoples, and is currently an Aboriginal Heritage Officer working on the protection and preservation of cultural places throughout Victoria. Please welcome Daniel.
Thank you. Hello everyone, you kind of stole my thunder. No, my name's Daniel Ross. I'm a proud Wurundjeri man. And I want to take this opportunity to share a little bit of my story, my ancestors' story with you all. But the lights here are so bright, it's phenomenal. Normally you can see the Birrarung behind us. And the Birrarung runs through country like the blood in our veins. But I'll get there. Bunjil is our creator, the wedge-tailed eagle. Bunjil created everything we see, from the stars in the sky to the roots of the trees in the ground. Those roots of the trees intertwine through one another, sharing resource, just as our knowledge has been passed from old to young, weaving through millennia. Bunjil taught us how to listen, how to care. But it's 2024. What does that mean now? And as you walk around Melbourne, you'll see the wattle starting to bloom. Pause. Pick up your phone. Turn to the person beside you. Ask how they're going. Because when we know the wattle blooms, we lose our elders, our knowledge holders, those living libraries. And when they join the dreaming, those libraries are burning to the ground. 2 years ago, we lost Uncle Jack and Uncle Archie. Last year, I had to visit my own mum. But there's a flip side. We see yam daisies coming to flower, tadpoles in ponds, fresh new exciting beginnings everywhere we look. Another was when we could take food, and well, I've got to put my hand up and take the blame for the lights because I'm an electrician by trade. But if we get away from the city lights, you can make out an emu on the horizon. And we knew when the emu stood up, we could take the egg. But as we traverse around the sun, the emu lays down. And it tells us the father's gone to nest and we wouldn't take the egg anymore. But 236 years ago, life as we knew it would change forever. And I'm undecided if it's for better or worse, but we're here collectively. I mentioned the Birrarung, the Yarra River. We've got the MCG not too far from here, which was once a place of song, dance, ceremony. Tanderrum, where we would come together with our neighbours, the Bunurong to the south, Wadawurrung to the southwest, Djadjurrung to the northwest, Tunurong to the north, Gunai to the east. It was phenomenal. Except we were forced off what was home to places like Bollambol and Billabong, and then they established this place known as Coranderrk. Now Coranderrk was one of the most profitable reserves of its day, the mission. Profitable not for us. We weren't allowed to speak our native tongue. We were forced to read and write English before it'd be forwarded a paycheck. So for those of you joining us tonight that speak a language other than English, I implore you to teach future generations, because losing language is an absolute travesty to the fabric and identity of who we all are. At the mission, our head man was Uncle Billabilary, and he walked from what we now know as Hillsville to Mnam, to Melbourne, to negotiate our first treaty. It was 12 axes, a few bags of rice, and a couple of blankets. But the Crown ripped it up. Us natives weren't worth that much. But on that journey were two little fellas, Uncle Simon Wonga and Uncle William Barak. And if you visit the shrine and look towards Carlton, you'll see Uncle Barak's face standing over 30 stories tall, still overlooking home today. He gave my great-grandmother the tribal name Bullumbulum. And for those of you from Melbourne, if I take you back about 8 weeks, it seems like it's Christmas time, but 8 weeks ago there was an abundance of little white butterflies absolutely everywhere. It was uncanny this year. Gentle, caring, nurturing. Unless you got a veggie garden, you probably weren't that impressed. But it was phenomenal to watch them go about their way. The old people have a way of knowing, a way of guiding. And Nam was instrumental in opening the first health service for Aboriginal people right here in Victoria. 1967, we had a referendum, we voted yes, Aboriginal people are human. Then I turned 21 I turned 21 last week, I'll say that. But for those that are here, 21 years ago, I was on this project that we know as, well, people of my age, Spencer Street Station. But I believe they call it Southern Cross now. Well, that was redeveloped 21 years ago, so for those that feel young like me, we're 21. But my first day of school, I wanted to share the stories of Bunjil and Moi, our creator, the lawman who brought us fire, Willert the possum who would grow with us. But my first day of school, I was torn apart, told I wasn't Aboriginal because I was fair-skinned. And I went home broken. I cried and vowed never to go back to school. My grandfather sat me down and brought me back to Bunjil's law on how we listen, how we care, how we come together collectively as one, and embracing Bunjil's law in everything we do. And that led me to go back to university, to get a degree in archaeology, to strive to protect those cultural places of my ancestors. Not because there's something in it for us, but knowing that the laws and the places that my ancestors lived have something for us all of us to gain. And that's the connection between tonight and how we have developers saying, yeah, but we can dig it all up and give it to you. But that changes the place to us. How do you appreciate it? How do you connect, take your shoes off and become grounded if it's dug up in bitumen? But we won't dwell on it. We will need to look forward and hold Bunjil's law at the very beginning on how we work collectively as one. I want to pay respects to my elders past and present. I want to pause and pay my respects to each and every one of you and to elders from all nations. Woman Jika Wurundjeri Bulak, Yemen Gundibek. In the Woiwurrung language, I just said welcome to the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. Our traditional lands go west to the Werribee River, north to the Great Divide, east to Mount Borbor, and south to Mordialloc Creek. Now, I want a new catchphrase for tonight, if we can try that, please, speakers. If you can repeat after me, that would be phenomenal. Noon. That was lackluster. We can do better than that. Come on. Noon. Godjen. That's how we say thank you in Woiwurrung. Nun Godjen.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. It's my incredible pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to what's going to be a wonderful event tonight. Before I do that, I'd just like to point out it's the Australia Institute's 30th anniversary. It's our 30th birthday this year. Thank you. And as part of that, we're putting on a range of events all over the year and all across the country, and this is one of the very special ones. And having Professor Joe Stiglitz out in Australia for a couple of weeks is a real highlight, as is tonight. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for all the support for the Australia Institute, to those in the room who help us out. And look around. You're not alone in thinking that as a country, we need to think about the big challenges we face and the big opportunities we face. Democracies thrive on high expectations, and you're not alone in thinking that Australia could be a much better place. So thank you for coming tonight, and let me just quickly introduce our wonderful guests tonight. Our first, as is customary to say, deserves no introduction but is going to get one, is Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Joe's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, former chief economist at the World Bank, and former president of the Council of Economic Advisors under Bill Clinton's government. Joe has written and spoken so extensively on so many issues we couldn't come close to describing them, but a lot of his work is on inequality, and his Nobel Prize in part was understanding information asymmetry, how when different people know different things, it's very hard for markets to work efficiently. We're really lucky to have him here to help us unpack the idea of greenwash tonight. Please, a round of applause for Professor Joe Stiglitz. We're also so lucky to have Senator Sarah Hanson-Young on stage with us tonight. Sarah's a senator for Queensland, senator for South Australia. South Australia. I don't think anyone has ever confused South Australia and Queensland before.
Certainly not Barnaby Joyce, that's for sure.
To be clear, Sarah is a senator for South Australia, and she's also chair of the recent Senate inquiry into greenwashing. Sarah's been in the Senate for 16 years now and is one of Australia's leading voices on so many issues, including refugee rights, inequality, and of course climate change and the environment. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Hanson-Young.
Thank you.
And to set the scene a bit tonight and in turn to throw a few questions to Sarah and Joe, Polly Hemming is the Australia Institute's Director of Climate and Energy. Polly's been working in these spaces for many years and, as many people in this room will know, has really in some sense in Australia led the charge to highlight many of the problems in Australian climate policy, particularly around the use of dodgy carbon offsets and greenwashing. So please help me join me in thanking Polly Hemming for... Over to you, Polly.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Richard. I just sort of check people can hear me okay. I'm losing my voice. I'm not unwell, just so no one worries, but yeah, I'm just speak like this. My kids love it. They said the house has never been quieter. Before I ask Professor Stiglitz and Senator Hanson-Young to make some opening comments and we move on to some discussion, I'm going to give you a bit of context for this event and how greenwashing has got to be such a problem, and how it's gone, particularly in Australia, from a problem to becoming something that's quite dangerous. So we all probably have a vague idea or a common understanding of what greenwash is, but just so we're all operating with the same definition, the ACCC, that's our consumer watchdog, says that, well, it considers a business will be engaging in greenwashing where it makes a claim that represents a product, service, or the business itself as better for or less harmful to the environment than it really is. Of course, we know Australians, including I would probably say everyone here, are concerned about the environment, and so we look for products and services that are going to help us reduce our impact. But the claims by businesses, whether they're claims being made about the environment or not, we have a baseline expectation that they're going to be truthful. That's our basic expectation, and that's also the official position of pretty much, well, I would say all consumer protection organisations around the world. But if you think about it, every claim by the private sector that we are subjected to, you know, every single ad you see, every sales pitch, they're all inherently designed to slightly manipulate or slightly deceive us. So going back to that ACCC definition, all marketing tries to tell us that a product or a service is better is better or less harmful than it actually is. And that might be breakfast cereals, cleaning products, theme parks, soft drinks. Like Coke's tagline used to be, Coke adds life. I've got chronically high blood sugar that says, actually, if anything, Coke takes life. But marketing by its very nature is designed to manipulate us all into believing that one product or service is superior to every other identical product or service that's in the market. But we're kind of willing to accept this corporate manipulation because it's pretty low risk. The stakes are pretty low. Hungry Jack's says the burgers are better at Hungry Jack's. The burgers probably aren't better at Hungry Jack's, but it's like $5. So what does it matter? National Australia Bank, or I don't know if it's called NAB or NAB now, its tagline is more than money. It's a bank. It's only about money. But we kind of know that banks lie, so yeah, sure, more than money. But the point I'm making is that we know that these statements aren't actually the hard truth, but we're willing to accept these kind of minor, vaguely deceptive claims because we're mostly informed enough to know the difference between, excuse me, emotional manipulation and straight-out lies. The trade-off between having almost unlimited choice and autonomy as consumers and investors is that the onus is on us to do our own research on the legitimacy of a claim. But that research, it usually isn't very taxing. You know, we can go and taste a Hungry Jack's burger for ourselves to decide if it's better. We can try and borrow money from National Australia Bank and find out for ourselves whether they really care about more than money. It's all very low stakes, low risk stuff. And it's low risk because even though we like choice, we also take for granted that our governments are protecting us from those products that are really dangerous, that would cause serious harm to us or others, because they don't even let them on the market. So our government has regulations about what can be sold. They've banned things like asbestos, engineered stone bench tops, codeine, CEFCs, lead paint. And that means that we're confident that a Hungry Jack's burger won't kill us because the government has made it illegal for people to serve food that poisons people. But the biggest risk to us is that the burger doesn't taste or look as good as they claim. We also take for granted that the government is protecting us from outright scams that could cause harm to us or others. So it's illegal to advertise tobacco products in Australia. So there's a kind of equilibrium there. But what happens when that equilibrium is upset? So what happens when governments are not regulating the harmful products or practices, harmful products or services, or the claims that are being made about them? And even worse, what if it's the government that is facilitating those claims or making those claims itself? So, for example, what would happen if the government suddenly stopped regulating medicines and therapeutic goods in Australia? The government just says, nah, we're cure neutral, we don't pick winners, we'll let the market decide. So you'd be taking your life into your own hands every single time you went to the pharmacy. If the government lets us evaluate medical claims, then the onus is on us to do our own medical research, which is time-consuming and highly, highly risky. So I don't know, I'm assuming most of us in this room, but are not experts in medicine or chemistry. So even if we read the label and we saw the ingredients, we don't know what it means. You know, pick up a bottle of vitamins and the word healthy on a bottle of vitamins could just be standard marketing guff, or healthy means contains less rat poison than other brands. Like you're just going to have to roll the dice and find out. This sounds ridiculous, but this is essentially where things are at in Australia when it comes to the environmental claims being made by the private sector. So we buy products that say green or sustainable or carbon neutral, because even though we, let's face it, don't really know what any of it means, we just trust that the government is not going to let the really bad things, the things that are harming the environment, be sold. Except even though that climate scientists have told us that producing and burning fossil fuels and clearing land unequivocally are the biggest contributors to climate change, the Australian government is not just approving dangerous products like new coal and gas, it's subsidising them. So Sarah has more direct experience, well, not direct experience subsidising them, but Sarah has more direct experience as a parliamentarian in this, and she can elaborate on it. But the Australian government itself is the very reason we have so much greenwashing in Australia in particular. Because if you're a government that is subsidising fossil fuels and approving gas and coal mines, but you've told the public that you're addressing climate change and biodiversity collapse, then your only real option is to help polluters cover up the fossil fuel expansion that is taking place. The government's only real option, and this is a technical term, the government's only real option is to cover its arse and deploy everything it can, or deploy what the Australia Institute calls state-sponsored greenwash. So instead of policies to reduce gas demand and eventually phase out gas, which is what the science says has to happen, the Australian government is passing legislation to help the gas industry open new gas basins. And then it helps greenwash the gas industry. Our climate change minister Minister Chris Bowen, has said publicly that gas companies can increase their production at the same time as meeting their climate targets if they buy some carbon offsets. And just for a basic definition, if you're not sure what a carbon offset is, basically that's when a business can keep putting emissions into the atmosphere because it's paid someone else to not put emissions into the atmosphere. The Australian government actually offers a carbon neutral certification called Climate Active. Again, Sarah can talk about this, which allows fossil fuel companies to purchase carbon offsets, and then the government will promote that organisation or that company as a carbon neutral organisation. And I know this because I used to be the person at Climate Active that was promoting those businesses. In 2021, Cooper Energy, which is a gas company, made a stock market announcement saying that it was Australia's first carbon neutral domestic gas producer on the basis that it had offset 1% of its emissions. It's 1%. At Cooper Energy's emissions intensity, its absolute emissions, so its emissions from all its operations and its gas productions, have increased since it was certified, but it's still a carbon neutral organisation. Australians are burning more petrol and diesel than ever before, which you know is bad for the climate and it's bad for human health. But thanks to the Australian government's carbon neutral scheme, Ampol can tell consumers it's part of the solution by selling carbon neutral petrol. And the government is generous enough to certify those carbon offsets that Ampol is buying, even though no one's ever checked the carbon offsets. Climate Active then promotes Ampol as a climate leader, even though it's not checking whether Ampol is a climate leader. By the way, Shell was banned from saying it was selling carbon neutral petrol in the Netherlands. So it's no wonder as consumers and investors and voters, I should say, that we're confused. If you see a stock market announcement that's saying a gas company is carbon neutral certified, is net zero by the government, you're going to buy those shares thinking that you're investing in gas, which is good for the climate, when actually your investment will be facilitating increased gas production that is contributing to the climate crisis. Polling by the Australia Institute actually shows that most Australians don't actually know what terms like carbon neutral and net zero mean, and that's totally understandable because most of the time I don't either. In fact, it's just made up, really, by most companies what that means. We don't have the information that we need to make decisions based on these claims. We can go to Hungry Jack's and we can taste and see a burger to make an informed decision. If we get it wrong, the stakes are pretty low. Go next door to McDonald's. But we can't see carbon dioxide, we can't see carbon neutrality. We don't know if carbon dioxide emissions are actually being reduced or being offset. And now we can't trust the institutions that we've been relying on to validate to verify that for us. And the stakes are really, really high. Stakes are really high for the whole globe if consumers are being misled about this stuff. So you could probably see why the Greens thought we needed a Senate inquiry into greenwashing in Australia. I think it's probably far worse than even I've realised. Actually, in fact, I will hand over to Sarah, but in fact, the Senate inquiry into greenwashing found, well, ACCC acknowledged this at the time, that the term carbon neutral itself was probably misleading. And the inquiry also revealed that the ACCC, and the Consumer Watchdog, had refused to sign off on the Climate Active certification trademark because the rules were too confusing. So not even the Consumer Watchdog will sign off on the government's carbon neutral certification. So this does seem like a really good time. I'm sorry I'm keeping you from being with Sarah and Joe. It's selfish of me, but this seems like a really good time to pass over to Sarah and ask her to make some comments. Sarah, I'm coming to you first because I think it's useful both for the audience and Professor Stiglitz to get your insights into the Australian context as someone who's been leading the debate on this. So if I can ask, you initiated the inquiry into greenwashing, and climate is a big part of it, but it's not all of it. It goes beyond climate. Can you explain why the Greens thought that it was necessary to initiate this inquiry.
Thanks, Polly, and thanks for having me along tonight. Greenwashing is everywhere, and it's not a new concept. I did a bit of a potted history of greenwashing in corporations over the last few decades, and found that, in the 1960s, when Westinghouse was also running nuclear power stations in the US, as well as selling washing machines, in the months just after nuclear meltdowns in Michigan and Idaho, they took out mass advertising across those states, saying that nuclear power was neat, clean, and friendly. Not to mention the environmental damage. And in fact, what they did was they put a picture of the environment next to, this kind of the nuclear power station with lots of budding flowers and beautiful trees. And then on the other side of the page was a double-page spread in magazines, women's magazines, housewives magazines. And on the other side of the double-page spread was a picture of a washing machine and a dishwasher with a woman filling up the dishwasher. And it said, while we are running neat, clean energy, we're making your life easier to be neat and clean too. So right back to the 1960s, big corporations have been in the game of greenwashing. In 2005, BP took out massive advertising in relation to coining the phrase carbon footprint. And they took out all this advertising to teach consumers what a carbon footprint was, putting the onus on the individual. And it said things like, how to calculate your own carbon footprint, and it would go through how people could do that. Did you know you could be making an impact on the environment by this and this? Not a mention of what BP's activities were. Of course, only 5 years later, in 2010, BP oversaw the world's largest oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which destroyed ecosystems and marine ecosystems for forever in some cases. So companies have been doing this for a long time. It wasn't until 2022, though, that the phrase greenwashing made its way into the dictionary. And I think part of that is because consumers, i.e. the community, have become more and more concerned about where their money goes and wanting to take agency over where they spend their money and the impact that that has on the environment. So while consumer demand for cleaner, greener, genuinely sustainable products has gone up, as too has the cleverness and the trickiness of marketing companies. Now, when you talk to advertisers and advertising agencies, they tell you, and they've told me this is at our Senate inquiry, they hate greenwashing. They hate it because it gives advertising a bad name.
They were doing a fine job on their own.
Right? So everyone's a bit wary of it. We all know there's something going on. Consumers, however, are still saying, and this is a recent survey, 45% of people say that they always or often consider sustainability as part of their choice when they buy a product or invest in a service. 69% said they were likely to trust a green claim if it had a trademark on it. So if it has a little trademark that says carbon neutral, well, that must be real. That must mean something. And Polly's already explained that the phrase is so broad and vague, no one seems to be able to understand what it means. In fact, when I asked the government department who was in charge of distributing this and licensing this trademark, I said, well, what does carbon neutral mean? And they could not give me an answer. No wonder the ACCC, the consumer watchdog, refused to actually give even an official trademark to this made-up trademark by this government agency. It's a very weird state of affairs, isn't it? You've got the consumer watchdog, whose job it is to legitimise trademarks. So you can't just whip out a trademark and whack it on anything. You have to, if you want it to be an officially registered trademark, it has to go to the ACCC, and the ACCC looks at a whole lot of rules and regulations and then says, okay, fine, you can use that, it's official. But they did not give the tick of approval to the Federal Environment Department's own logo of carbon neutral. Which has a nice little graphic, and it says carbon active. I'm sure a lot of these projects are carbon active because they're pumping out a whole lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Woolworths, Coles, they've been doing this too. They've come up with their own sustainable fishing logo. And it's a little logo that has a really nice picture of a whale or a dolphin, and it says responsibly sourced, and they use it on salmon. And you know the issue with salmon right now, in Tasmania in particular? There is nothing responsible about the salmon farming in Tasmania. I was just in Hobart yesterday talking to a number of people about that down there, including former Senator Bob Brown. And I was talking to him about this engagement I had with the woman from Woolworths at the Senate inquiry. And I said, well, how do you know it's responsibly sourced? Where does it come from? Oh, it comes from the Macquarie Harbour. Do you know that that's pushing the skate there in Tasmania to extinction? Oh yeah, we are a bit worried about that. Well, so how is that responsibly sourced? Now, this pressure from the community about these things is starting to make companies like Woolworths and Coles rethink whether they use these trademarks. But the concern is that they're everywhere. These broad, vague claims are everywhere. And it's because the community is wanting to be more proactive and take some agency over where we spend our money. And we are worried about the state of the planet. But the ACCC, again, the consumer watchdog, they did a sweep of green claims and products. And they found that 57% of green claims that are made on products are dubious. So you've got more than half a chance every time you walk into the supermarket, or an electricity provider rings you up and tries to get you to change your energy provider, or whether you're buying beauty products or clothes, when they claim to be green, there's a higher chance that they're not. There's something wrong with the rules here. And it is right that we need to have government ensuring that if they're handing out certification, that they're correct, that they're not a cover for dubious and negative environmental or climate products. But we actually need to make it illegal to lie when it comes to making these claims. It should be illegal to say that you are offering a green product, to sell that, to market that, often to sell it at a premium price when you're not. Huge voter and community support for that. That's why in the EU they've moved to implement a whole lot of new laws in relation to greenwashing. And in the United States, the Federal Trade Association is doing the same thing. I'm not sure if they'll go as far yet as the EU will, but countries right around the world know that this is a problem, and governments are trying to tackle it. We are really behind the 8 ball here in Australia, and we need to catch up. Our Senate inquiries had so many submissions and amazing evidence, but what we really need to get to is a point of putting in regulations, putting in laws into the Parliament to clean it up. Because if we don't, Polly, you're right, the cost is actually too high. It's not just that in the midst of a cost of living crisis, people are being tricked to spend money on things that are not real, and often at a higher or a premium price point. But actually, we are running out of time to tackle the climate crisis and the environmental and biodiversity crisis. And if people lose trust that the institutions are not adhering to that type of integrity, then it'll be harder and harder to make the big calls in terms of the changes that we need to see. So it is something we need to tackle, and I'm really keen to hear Joe's ideas about what we should be doing here in Australia. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Joe, I'm really interested to hear observations after hearing from Sarah and myself, because you probably don't have any of these issues in the United States. But I want to ask you a question first. Climate change is a pretty big problem. Is this something that should be left to consumers to fix? Because that's where we're at, really, is that consumers are expected to tackle the climate crisis.
Well, it is a societal problem, and it has to be fixed at a societal level. We call these global public goods. It affects everybody, and therefore it has to be done at the global level, but then it has to be brought down to the national level. I do think consumers, individuals, have a role both as voters to try to push governments to do it, and in their choice of investments and consumption. So let me, and that's where greenwashing comes in, because in making those decisions, they have to have good information. And it's true not only of consumers, but investors, because a lot of investors also want their money to go where the companies are green. And they want to go where it's green for two reasons. One, they care about our planet. That's unusual, but there are some people who do care about the planet, who are investors. So that's one. And the second one is that most people should know that sometime in the not too distant future, the economic consequences of climate change are going to finally be realized. We're already getting things like, in the United States, we have about a loss on some years up to 1% to 2% of GDP from extreme weather events. And the estimate is that by the end of the century, it'll be between 1% and 4% every year. And so it's going to be very costly, and it's going to be very costly to particular firms. And it's going to be costly to two categories of firms. The fossil fuel firms, or the firms that haven't adapted to climate change. I think it's inevitable that there will eventually be strong regulations, public regulations, against fossil fuels and other kinds of activities like cement that emit high levels of greenhouse gases. So when those regulations, rules, carbon prices, whatever form it takes, come into place, the value of those assets that are emitting are going to fall. We call them stranded assets. And the effect of this is that the prices of those stocks are going to go down. So in a sense, good investor regulation requires good disclosure and no greenwashing. So that's why in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission, led by Gary Gensler, who's been the head of it since Biden got elected, have been promulgating regulations about your exposure and your to carbon, the extent to which your production processes emit, and illustrates a set of general principles you have to have disclosures, but you have to have disclosures in ways that people can understand them. And so they're trying to get standardized ways, because one of the things that your story about stories illustrate, the firms that are emitters don't want to raise their hand and say, yeah, we're really bad. They're going to try to disclose the information in ways that you can't understand it. So
Exactly.
even if it's not fraudulent, and fraud is massive, but even if it's not fraudulent, it's mischaracterizing.
It's tricky.
It's
being
tricky.
tricky.
It's tricky. And that boundary for the law is really difficult between, and that's why in cigarettes, what they had to do, cigarettes, the cigarette company said there was skepticism about, a doubt about whether cigarettes were killing people, when the cigarette companies knew that they were. And then there were disclosure requirements. And then in very small print, they would say, this may not be good for your health. In most countries around the world now, they say not only do you have to disclose it on the package, but because of the trickiness, they want a picture that tells you very forcefully what it does. Now, my own feeling is, on every gas pump, they should have a picture of showing what the gas that you're buying is doing to planet Earth.
It's a great idea. Let's get that done.
So somehow, we have to begin to think about how do we visualize, because tricking here is recharacterizing what you're doing is one of the key ingredients. I have to tell a story of, for a long time I went every year to Davos, was a place where all the muckety-mucks get together to discuss where the world is going. And for some reason, they often invite me to a small meeting of CEOs of some of the major banks around the world, and responsible investment, sustainable investment, all the good things that firms are supposed to do, and they all come out there and say how good they are and how they're working so hard for workers, for the environment, for the community. One of the major banks in the world announced how they were so sustainable. They had put in all their offices all over the world green light bulbs. So I asked them, are you making any loans to coal companies? And he looked at me as if, angry, as if I had gone off script. That wasn't part of the show that they were supposed to, and the answer was, of course, I knew they were doing massive coal loans. They were doing massive financing, and that's a form of greenwashing. Mm-hmm. And that's why, when you disclose what you're doing, it may be that your light bulbs are all very, very clean, but meanwhile, you're making very, very dirty loans. Mm. So that's why there is an attempt to try to not only require disclosure of information, to disclose it in a standard form, and a standard form that's interpretable, say, to investors. And then the third part that's really important, and part of the discussion right now going on in Australia, there has to be enforcement. And, information is a public good, and from which we all benefit, and it's one area where markets don't work well. It's all about not providing the right information, and this is especially important in this area because unlike when you buy a table or a refrigerator or anything else, you get to see whether it works or not. So you can make a judgment whether they are telling you a lie. And if they're telling you a lie, you won't go buy them next time. But in this case, you're not seeing those CO2 molecules as they go up out of that plant. You can't see what they're actually doing. There's no way that you as an individual could really assess directly. So you have to rely on someone else. And you have to rely either on the government that says you have to disclose that information, and if you lie to us, there are consequences. Or you have a regulation, you have to disclose it to your consumers, to your investors, to the community. And if you lie,
you cop it.
Yeah, there are consequences. We have fraud laws that say you can't lie, and one of the reasons we have those fraud laws is that often you can't tell, and if you can't tell, you get distorted investment. And one of the things that was really striking was in those in the 2008 crisis that one of your prime ministers refers to as the North Atlantic crisis, because he said Australia managed it better, so it's not a global crisis, it's the North Atlantic crisis. But in the North Atlantic in America, they had to do with the securities, and we've now had time to look inside those securities. They were called mortgage-backed securities. They'd have 1,000 securities or 10,000. We've now looked at it, and it turns out that more than half of them were fraudulent. But nobody would have the time to do that before you bought it. If you inspected those mortgages, you'd be poor. So you rely on fraud laws and government to enforce those fraud laws, which our government didn't do. But here, the consequences for the whole planet are very severe. So you need government to not only have these laws, the laws about disclosure, but also, and against fraud, but also enforce those laws. But you need more eyes than just the government. And that's where I think NGOs, civil society, and class action suits become very important. And the notion of class action suits is that you find somebody who's inspecting and sees that this firm is lying and wants to hold them accountable, but one person can't do it.
Can I add some context for that for you, which I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on? So the Australian government does have climate disclosure laws that it is introducing. At the same time as introducing those laws, it is proposing a 3-year moratorium on civil greenwashing litigation. So it's making sure that you can't have NGOs or civil society questioning the disclosure being made by those companies.
Yeah, that's why I was making those remarks. I know about that.
Oh, dear. Sorry, apologies, please go on.
I wanted to point out, I thought that was a bad idea. That 3-year moratorium is like tying your hands of the one enforcement, of one of the most important enforcement mechanisms. And it's particularly important when you have governments with limited revenues. They don't have the resources to go out and inspect as much as they should. And so I mean, they do it to some extent, but nowhere near as much as they should. And then if you have the eyes of the whole society on there, and everybody in the society is saying, if we discover this, we're going to hold you accountable. And that's why class action suits are a very important part of what I would say society's checks and balances. And, you know, and particularly in this area where I always said that individuals can't see it themselves. They can't just decide, I won't buy the good. It's very different from that. And so that's why I was particularly concerned that Australia was going in that direction.
Yeah, and I wanted to get your thoughts as well. I know what Sarah's thoughts are because I heard her in the Senate inquiry. I think you compared climate active to utopia, actually.
It did feel like an episode of Utopia, that's for sure.
The example I gave where, yes, I agree that you need governments and you need regulation, but if you have a gas company like the one I mentioned that is disclosing its emissions, and it's disclosing that its emissions are increasing, its emissions intensity are increasing, its gas production is increasing, but it is making stock exchange announcements saying that we're carbon neutral certified by the government, it's not, consumers aren't, or investors aren't going to be able to tell for them, well, they can see the numbers, the government can see the numbers. The climate impact is increasing, but the government says, this is fine, this is okay. That's kind of corrupting the whole system that we rely on for those checks and balances, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, that's why we have whistleblower laws that say that within government, if things aren't going right and they know it, they should disclose it. I mean, I think this is part of my general view of how you run society. You need lots of checks and balances. And there are lots of conflicts of interest. There are lots of misplaced incentives, distorted incentives, all over the place, in both the public and the private sector. So, once you realize this fallibility of our you need to have laws like whistleblower laws, strong media as another set of eyes that is looking at things and holding people and institutions accountable. I think the problems posed by some of the structures, like you were talking about carbon offsets, are particularly problematic because in two ways. Some of the offsets are like you won't cut down a forest. But what you care about is not that particular forest. What you want is the total deforestation in the world to be limited. Nobody really cares whether this forest is cut down or that forest cut down. It's really deforestation globally. So you can't tell if this guy says, I'm going not to cut down my forest, is that going to be incremental at all to the global deforestation? And actually, market forces are such that if he's not cutting down his forest, prices of lumber go up, and others will be incentivized to cut down their forest. So in that particular example, unless you have a global agreement about all the forestry in the world, which we will never have, that particular kind of carbon offset means zero, and you shouldn't even allow it, because it just is not going to have any effect. But more generally, monitoring these offsets is very difficult. And the incentives are just like all the other perverse incentives that we have to try to lie. They won't say lie, but but to be overly optimistic about your carbon reductions. And so you promise a lot. Nobody checks what is going to happen. You're going to have an incentive to be even more overly optimistic. And the guy who buys it doesn't care. He gets the credit. And so the system, again, doesn't have the system of checks and balances within the system. It's all then turned over to the government or to some private guy who has also perverse incentives, and then you have to monitor. You have to have there's an old expression, going back, who monitors the monitors? And so since you can't observe it easily, you have a monitor, then you have to have a monitor of the monitor. And so this is a fundamental problem that makes greenwashing so easy. It's so hard to tell whether it's occurred. And yeah.
I was going to say that I think whether it's in relation to carbon and climate change and cutting emissions, or whether it's in relation to greenwashing claims about recycled plastic or sustainability claims about clothes or fashion or beauty products, or indeed other types of products that people buy. At the end of the day, I think we also need disclosure, and we need that transparency. We need the regulations in order to hold those who do the wrong thing accountable. There needs to be some guidelines, and in the EU example, they've outlawed the use of the words carbon neutral. You can't use it. And there's a whole lot of other kind of vague words like eco-friendly. And if you do make a green claim, you have to have it backed up by rigour and science. I mean, it seems to me a pretty basic measure. If you're going to claim to do something, you've got some evidence for it. But then I would say the third thing, and this is where government is falling down, is we shouldn't just be saying that if the consumer buys these products or these services and that they do happen to be green. Your point about the incentives for others to do the wrong thing means, where are the laws to protect nature? Where are the laws to stop deforestation? Where are the laws to stop the further expansion of fossil fuels and of pollution? So you actually need all three of those things working together, which, there's a big role for government in that, but also a big role for the community. But unless you can't just have a certification program that is strong and robust, you also need the laws in place to stop the bad things from happening too.
Yeah, so we don't look for labels that say this product wasn't made with child slavery in Australia, because we know that child slavery is illegal in Australia, so it's a pretty safe bet that no product is. So I think, sorry Joe, I've interrupted you, but there is a role to just stop the harm happening in the first place, so then we don't have to worry about the greenwashing of something.
No, absolutely right. I mean, that is to say, a bank shouldn't have to say, we don't make coal loans to electric generating plants using coal. It should be illegal. So the bank wouldn't have to answer the question, do we make bad loans? Those kind of bad loans should be forbidden. And that's a lot easier than asking investors to inspect their portfolio, their loan portfolio, which is extraordinarily expensive. So in that sense, simple regulations can get at much of the problem of greenwashing, because you're not allowed to be dirty in that way.
So are you saying that if the government announced that it was not going to approve any new gas and coal projects, that this would become a much smaller problem? If the government was regulating and phasing out fossil fuel use, we wouldn't have to worry about carbon neutral claims, maybe?
Well, I think you still would, but you would capture a large fraction of the worst behaviors. You know, that I've seen estimates that, you know, there are a limited number of activities that if you regulated them well, banned some of the activities, you could reduce carbon emissions by something like 75%. It's still true that you know, there are lots of small adjustments that people can make that make things more sustainable, make things, you know, reduce carbon emissions, and therefore there ought to be pressure for them to be better in every one of the dimensions. But you go a long way just banning a lot of the worst activities so they don't have to say, I don't make coal loans.
So I'm going to use that opportunity, we've got a federal election next year. We hear a lot of claims by government and industry. I'm going to ask you this too, Sarah. We hear a lot of claims about what government and industry are doing to address the climate crisis. That includes opening new gas basins. So we are reducing emissions in Australia by increasing emissions, apparently. So people know, so people don't have to unpick every claim they hear. Could you tell me some of those things that should be banned? So if they're not being banned, if the government says in Australia they're not banning them, they know what they are saying is probably greenwash. Does that make sense? Tell me what needs to be banned.
Well, I mean, obviously, coal mines need to be banned.
Coal mines.
That's the... you know, at this point, there is really no reason for using coal. We have better energy sources. I think you want to focus not just on the negative, but also on the positive. That renewable energy the cost has come down, and that was with very little government expenditure in R&D. If government had made more expenditures to bring the cost down more, I think it would have lowered those energy prices. So I don't think it's just a negative story, it's also a positive. We're restructuring the economy and so encouraging the green transition. The hardest things, you know, are there are some ways of making cement that have much lower emissions than other ways. So we should make sure that there are no cement plants that use old technologies, even if they're a little cheaper, and just say you have to use the new technologies. And that's true in a lot of other processes where there's a lot of emissions. I mean, these are the big emission areas where we know we can, you know, electric vehicles is another one. There should be no, there should be all electric vehicles, but electric vehicles only reduce emissions if electricity is produced in a renewable energy. So if you're going to push towards electric vehicles, you also have to push very strongly towards making sure that all the energy is produced, or most of the energy is produced by renewable energy. So that's why I say you have to think about these much more, not only at banning, but in systems transition.
Do you incentivize more renewable energy by subsidizing fossil fuels?
No, there are some things.
No coal, no fossil fuel subsidies. More money for renewables.
Subsidizing fossil fuels makes no sense. I've heard that Australia actually subsidizes some gas that you export.
Yeah, baby. A lot of it. Sadly, a lot of it.
I find that mind-boggling. That's a technical term. I don't understand it, and I've been asking people, and I haven't gotten a good explanation of why you would do something like that. But we do a lot of crazy things too, so I don't want to think that you have a monopoly on that. Right now, just to show you the complexity of it and how right now there's a lot. United States has become one of the largest energy exporters with one of the Middle East countries. And there's been a lot of anxiety about energy insecurity in many countries around the world. And there's a debate how to respond, and the Republican view is drill, drill, drill. Coal is over, but oil and gas are really big. There is a distinction in this between fracking, which has other negative environmental effects, and say deep sea gas and oil exploration. The reason is fracking, you get the capital out in 3-4 years, you can shut it down. It's a short-term investment, and the view is that in a few years we'll have more renewables. And so that is at least an argument that you could make, that while we're getting our renewable sector going, we might use a form of fossil fuels that we could shut down. The danger is the political economy is they don't like to shut down afterwards.
Yeah.
But what the oil industry wants are the kinds of wells that last for 30, 40 years. And with everybody talking about 2050, that's only 28 years, and a 30, 40-year well, if it takes 10 years to develop a field, it's a 50-year well. So their mindset is not, they're admitting that they have no plans at carbon neutrality by 2050. Their mindset is the world is going to go on somehow with a dependency on fossil fuels. And so they've revealed sort of their mindset, I think, strongly by what they're doing in this.
Sarah, I think Joe pointed out before that, climate policy, greenwashing regulation, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Who monitors the monitors? In Australia, we lock up whistleblowers. In Australia, we have increasing we lock up protesters too. So the monitors are making sure no one can monitor them. As I said, we're close to an election. We still don't have truth in political advertising laws in Australia. What's the interaction there, or what are the parallels between having no truth in political advertising laws and greenwashing in Australia?
Well, I think there's some similarities, of course. I mean, it is crazy. I'm not sure if, your election is pretty bonkers too right now. I really do hope, for what it's worth, that Vice President Harris can make this a tighter contest than it looked like it was going to be. But look, we're in a situation where if you're a political party or you're a third party, someone in the community who wants to make a political claim in the context of the election, you can say whatever you want, you can put it on a brochure, you can make a television ad, and it does not have to be true. And that is crazy. I mean, we are at a point in time where there is increasing distrust of governments, of institutions, of the media, and we have laws that actually allow the voter to be lied to by the very same people who want to take their vote. So we do need truth in political advertising rules. I know that the government there's rumours around new donation reform coming possibly in the next few weeks in Parliament. I can see Zoe Daniel MP down here at the front. Stand up and have a wave, Zoe. And as Zoe would know, these are laws that are hotly contested. But it strikes me that the government is leaving out in the cold the thing that really is going to help voters and help the community to decipher what's going on, and that would be truth in political advertising. You should not be able to lie to get somebody's vote. It should be illegal.
Let me just to add to that. There was in terms of the social media, there was a wonderful exchange in our Congress Senate between Elizabeth Warren and Mark Zuckerberg, where she said, "Can anybody say anything about anything as long as it's a politician? And you'll disseminate it over Facebook?" And he said, yes. There should be no restraint, no truth on the part of anybody in any context when it's politics.
Yes, well, I think the mis and disinformation that is disseminated online, and particularly in on those social media platforms, is increasingly a problem. And we saw that actually, the intersection of the use of social media for mis and disinformation and the lack of truth in political advertising rules during the referendum. It was an explosion of lies that were promoted and paid for online. And I do think the government should have acted in the quick response to that. But look, we've got a few sitting weeks of Parliament left before the next election. Maybe we could get something done.
Sarah, the committee is yet to release its final report into the Senate inquiry into greenwashing. I don't know if you're allowed to give any spoilers. Are you allowed to give?
No, that would be a breach of parliamentary privilege. But look, I think it's really clear that Australia's laws are deficient. And you're right, Joe, you've said a number of times tonight that these issues are global. Whether we're talking about regulating social media or we're talking about reducing the influence and the damage that fossil fuel industries are doing, just the same, the big corporations who want to keep greenwashing so that they can make big bucks while the laws are still laxed. It is a global problem, so we do need to be working with our international counterparts. But Australia is so far behind, and we've got a lot of catching up to do. The EU in particular, I think they have paved the way, and we should be following them. So you won't be surprised to see in the final report some movement in that direction, hopefully.
And in terms of, so again, both you and Joe sort of alluded to this, that addressing greenwashing, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need robust regulations, but you also need governments with integrity who are willing to introduce do no harm laws and enforce regulations. Basically, you have to have governments that are acting in good faith. So this is wordy, sorry, I'm speaking as I think. If you want to address greenwashing in Australia, actually acting as a voter just as much as a consumer, or engaging in democracy just as much as you are at the supermarket, is critical to achieving those laws and regulations. Is that fair to say? I'm just trying to think how...
If people want no more expansion of coal and gas, I'd be telling you to vote Green. I mean, no surprises here. I'd say if you want laws that outlaw greenwashing, then, well, you know, vote Green. But actually, it's more than this. It's the community demanding whatever colour you want to vote for. It's demanding that when your politicians say they're going to do something, you hold them to account to do it. And I think when it comes to this broader issue, you're right, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. The reason companies are greenwashing is because they know consumers want better choices. If they didn't think consumers cared, they wouldn't do it. Right? They do it because they know that when you go into the supermarket and you're staring at that wall of plastic bags, lunch bags, this, you know, bin liners, that, and the one that says 50% recycled against everything else, you think, oh, well, I guess that's doing a little bit more. Sadly, however, and we've got this through our inquiry, chances are that 50% is bogus. And that is a really, really terrible thing, because when you're standing there in the supermarket wanting to make a choice, wanting to feel like you can make a difference, and you are being undermined, that does not lead to a, you know, healthy, engaged electorate for election time.
Yeah, I think all this undermines trust in society. And so, you know, green is important because of the environment, but it goes more deeply into our society. And that's the same thing about fraud more generally, and the transmission of fraud over social media. So I think, you know, there's the direct harm that the fraud creates, but there's also the indirect harm that this creates. And the hard challenge has been, besides the politics, is the worry that what we call in the United States First Amendment rights, free speech, will be impaired by the government. But we've always said there are limits on free speech. We've always said limits like you can't cry fire in a crowded theater, you can't make fraudulent statements, truth in advertising. So we've always recognized that there are these limits on free speech, and as our society has changed, technology's changed, social media has presented a new challenge, we have to redefine the balance. And it's very clear that in this particular case, the balance is such that the transmission by social media of clearly false statements is bad for our society. And I think our democracies can rise to the challenge of creating institutions that deal with it. You know, and the argument on the other side is, well, look at Russia or China. We're not Russia or China. We can develop institutions that have the ability to make decisions between, you know, truth and falsity. You know, we can ascertain whether vaccines kill you, or whether they're putting a chip in your shoulder, in you, that is going to control you for the rest of your life. You know, that was one of the anti-vax statements that were going around social media. We have mechanisms where we can feel comfortable, I think, saying you cannot transmit socially harmful statements, fraudulent statements, over any form of media. And that would include greenwashing. So in many ways, the discussion of greenwashing raises the broader issue of fraud in our society.
And integrity.
And integrity and trust.
That's right.
Ooh, that's a really nice point to end on, which is lucky because I mean it. It was like that was orchestrated. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I think the boss likes to wrap things up. But I am just going to be completely brazen because this event was called Greenwashing. How do we fix it? And I feel like we owe you an answer. And so I'm just going to sum up. Shut down coal mines. Stop subsidising fossil fuels. Give more money to decarbonisation and renewables and energy efficiency. Vote for governments that are going to do that. Don't vote for politicians that lie, I've got here as well. And that's pretty much it. Richard, did you want to say a few words?
There are a few more things. I just
okay,
want to
go. Write this down.
No, you have to pass fraud laws.
Yes.
And you have to pass laws. You have to pass laws that require disclosure and that have the disclosures in forms that are interpretable and that don't engage in trick.
That don't, yes, exactly.
Don't trick people. And that you have to enforce these laws. And enforcement entails multiple forms of enforcement, not only public, but also by class action suits and giving rein to whistleblowers, trying to think about how we create systems of checks and balances in our society. Again, a more general principle.
Oh, I love that. Okay, stop locking up whistleblowers, because we do that. We send them to jail in Australia. Stop locking up protesters. Maybe I'll just sum that up as stop censoring democratic participation. That's pretty good. That captures that. Good. Thank you, Joe and Sarah. You fixed it.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'll just say a few words, but how about a quick round of applause for... to Joe and Sarah and Polly for fixing it. Because I mean this, at the Australia Institute, we like to work on big things, but actually kind of key to our work is that actually simple solutions are better than complicated solutions. And if we want to bring people into democratic debates, then we need to have simple solutions that people can get behind and then hold people accountable for. So let's leave tonight with a few other thoughts. Australia is the third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. There are 100 new coal and gas projects seeking approval in Australia. We give half the gas we export away for free, but we could fix that. We could, if we changed the rules, if we listened to things like we heard tonight. Our choices really do matter in a democracy. Different democracies make different decisions. In Norway, they tax their fossil fuel industry and subsidise higher education. In Australia, we subsidise the fossil fuel industry and charge our kids a fortune to go to uni. Choices really matter. We collect more revenue in Australia from HECS than we do from the petroleum resource rent tax. And the good thing about knowing things that shocking is knowing that it's actually possible to fix it. And we can introduce accountability rules. We can ban things that do harm. We banned whaling, we banned asbestos. We didn't have a whale trading scheme. There was no asbestos offsets. This is not beyond our wit, but it does take big ideas and it does take big engagement. So thank you very much, and please, again, join me in thanking our guests.